After the meteoric success of the Nintendo DS line of systems, it was always going to be difficult for Nintendo to follow it up, but somehow they managed to do it, with the Nintendo 3DS line also finding great success. However, it didn't always look that way. The Nintendo 3DS got off to a horrible start, with many thinking it may end up as a total flop, but Nintendo was able to turn it around. Let's take a look at the complete history of the Nintendo 3DS to figure out how to save a console. From 2004 to 2010, Nintendo supported their handheld line called the Nintendo DS. There were multiple different variations over the years, including the DS Lite, DSi, and DSi XL. As many of you probably already know, the DS line of systems was massively successful, reportedly selling around 154 million units. This makes it one of the best-selling video game consoles of all time, so it wasn't all too surprising to see Nintendo announce another DS variant in March 2010, but this time it was different. On March 23, 2010, Nintendo released a short press release simply stating, "Nintendo Company will launch Nintendo 3DS during the fiscal year ending March 2011, on which games can be enjoyed with 3D effects without the need for special glasses." As the press release continued, it became clear that this 3DS console would be considered the successor to the DS line and would not be just another variation. Looking back, it's such a strange way to announce a console. It's pretty hilarious to see how casually they announced the successor to their most popular console ever. And it was also strange because Nintendo put out this press release just a few days before the DSi XL was released in North America. A lot of people, myself included, skipped the DSi XL because we knew a replacement would be coming in the near future. You would think Nintendo would at least wait for all of the DS models to release before this announcement. Many have assumed Nintendo did this to avoid a leak, and that makes sense to me. Regardless of the reason for this mundane press release, we would have to wait a few more months before learning more about the Nintendo 3DS. E3 2010 was one of Nintendo's greatest conferences ever, featuring Skyward Sword, Kirby's Epic Yarn, and Donkey Kong Country Returns. But for the finale of the show, they finally talked about the 3DS. The presentation starts with then President of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, talking about the 3D trend in entertainment. I feel like nowadays people are over 3D. When they hear it, they kind of roll their eyes. But we have to remember, this was a huge thing back around 2010. 3D movies were a big draw to get people into theaters. Just a year prior, in 2009, Avatar, the highest grossing movie of all time, was released, and a major reason for that movie's success was its groundbreaking use of 3D technology. At that same time, some companies were experimenting with in-home 3D entertainment. In 2010, Sony had started producing televisions that could display 3D images, but as Reggie notes during this presentation, these TVs were unbelievably expensive, and there also wasn't a lot of content being made that actually took advantage of the 3D capabilities. Not to mention the fact that you were required to wear glasses. That's another added cost, and a lot of people just simply didn't want to wear 3D glasses when trying to sit at home and relax. That's why Nintendo 3DS was going to try and change everything by introducing glasses-free 3D. After a short video, the late great Satoru Iwata came out and held up the console for the world to see for the first time. The console itself looked very similar to what you would expect from a DS console, with one major difference, being the circle pad above the D-pad. Well, actually at the time they were calling it the slide pad. This slide pad was extremely exciting to see. As anyone who grew up playing Super Mario 64 DS knows, playing 3D games with a D-pad is not ideal. Having this slide pad was going to open up so many new possibilities. Iwata then mentions one of the most important features of the 3DS console, the 3D slider. This slider could be adjusted to better suit your preference of the 3D effect, or you could even turn it off altogether. This was really great news. Even in a time when 3D was at its peak popularity, there were concerns about a console that forced you to play in 3D at all times. It could cause eye strain or become annoying in unstable play environments such as a car ride. So knowing that you could turn the 3D off entirely if you wanted to was a big relief for many. I've always appreciated how Nintendo saw this from the beginning and didn't have to wait for player feedback and complaints to realize that the 3D effect may need to be adjusted. I hadn't watched this conference in years, so what Iwata talked about next really surprised me. After going over some more of the basic console features, Iwata begins speaking about movies. He mentions how the 3DS is capable of displaying 3D movies, and they would be partnering with major studios such as Disney, Warner Brothers, and DreamWorks. He specifically mentioned that Tangled and How to Train Your Dragon will have 3D trailers available to view at their E3 booth. I find it extremely interesting to see Nintendo mention movies before they have even shown a game. Clearly, Nintendo hoped the 3DS could become a multimedia machine and felt the 3D effect could give them a one-up in this space. Unfortunately for Nintendo, these plans never really came together. There were some 3D game trailers released, and with some finagling you could view certain YouTube videos in 3D via the YouTube app, but 3D movies and trailers never really happened on the 3DS. Even with apps like Netflix being available, it was just displayed in regular 2D. I'm not entirely sure why this initiative fell apart. My first thought would be maybe the movies just didn't look good enough on the screen. The 3D effect was certainly on the same level as a theater, but the screen itself wasn't HD, so it naturally wasn't going to look as good. Maybe testing of this feature just wasn't super popular, or maybe the movie studios themselves felt it wasn't worth the extra effort. Whatever the reason was for this failed initiative, I really do wonder what the sales of the 3DS could have looked like if this all came together, and if people had viewed it as the go-to non-theater 3D movie experience. After this, Nintendo gets to the games, and their first announcement was one that no hardcore Nintendo fan will ever forget.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
I still get chills when I watch this trailer back. Kid Icarus was one of the most obscure Nintendo franchises, one that most assumed would never make a return. Pit had become more well known thanks to his inclusion in Smash Bros. Brawl, but I never would have thought he would get a new game. Nor did I ever think this new game would be the first marquee title Nintendo would use to promote a new console. Despite its general obscurity, it's clear to see why Nintendo chose Kid Icarus Uprising as its first showcase game for the Nintendo 3DS. The graphics were extremely impressive and showed how much of a step up the 3DS would be from the DS technically. The fantastic character models and fully 3D world showed exactly why the 3DS was being considered a new system and not just a DS variant. Nintendo's only other first-party announcement at this E3 presentation was Nintendogs plus Cats. Now I must admit, having these two games as your first and only games announced alongside a new system feels strange. Don't get me wrong, Kid Icarus Uprising was an incredible announcement for hardcore fans. Uprising is one of my favorite 3DS games of all time, and my god, what I wouldn't do for a modern port of that game. But we can't deny its obscurity and the fact that the more casual fans probably didn't even know what Kid Icarus was. Meanwhile, Nintendogs was a big announcement simply due to how many copies Nintendogs had sold on DS. But this is more of a casual game, a game that the people who watch E3 probably don't care about, and the people who will buy the game probably don't watch E3. I guess my point is just that these announcements left hardcore and casual gamers happy, but left out that middle ground who probably would have liked to see a Mario or Zelda announcement thrown in there. They did have some demos like Mario Kart 3DS and Paper Mario 3DS on the E3 show floor, although it wasn't totally clear at the time if they were new games or just tech demos. But I mean, yeah, we can assume games like Mario, Mario Kart, and Zelda are coming eventually. I guess it doesn't really have to be said, but what we can't assume is coming is third-party support. This is something that Nintendo had been struggling with since the N64 era, and it became even worse during the Wii and DS era. Nintendo's unconventional systems made it hard to garner early third-party support. Even once the consoles became so successful that the third parties did come over, their games weren't always of the highest quality. Nintendo hoped to address this immediately with the 3DS and had an entire third-party showcase ready to show at this E3. Nintendo mentioned almost every third-party company you could think of, such as Square Enix with Kingdom Hearts, Capcom with Resident Evil and Street Fighter, Konami with Metal Gear Solid. Even EA would be there with Madden and FIFA. Okay, but seriously, it really was a breath of fresh air to see third-party developers get behind the 3DS. They showed a sizzle reel of some high-profile developers talking about the system and what they thought of it. You're gonna hear third parties talk like this about basically every new console, but I do feel like in this video you could see some genuine passion. These developers truly seemed very excited to work with this hardware and were enthralled by the possibilities of 3D gameplay. That was the end of our first introduction to Nintendo 3DS. Those who were able to get their hands on the console at E3 reported that the screen was incredible and worked exactly as advertised. The hype for this console was incredibly high, and thankfully we wouldn't have to wait much longer for it to be released. The Nintendo 3DS launched in North America on March 27, 2011, and despite the initial hype the console had, it got off to a very rocky start. I think one of the primary reasons for that was the poor lineup of launch games. There were 16 games available at launch, with 13 of them being from third parties. There were some notable ones such as Super Street Street Fighter 4 3D Edition and Super Monkey Ball 3D. However, a lot of the launch titles were just 3DS versions of games that already existed. So while it was cool to see something like LEGO Star Wars 3 or Rayman 3D on the platform, these weren't games that you needed a 3DS to play. Nintendo, on the other hand, had 3 games of their own available day one. Nintendo has a pretty incredible history of launch titles, so I couldn't wait to see what they had cooked up for the Nintendo 3DS. Nintendo's 3 games for the 3DS launch were Pilot Wings Resort, Nintendogs Plus Cats, and Steel Diver. Yeah, I think it goes without saying that this was a pretty lackluster lineup. Nintendogs Plus Cats is understandable, considering the success they had with that franchise on DS. However, I think they may have overestimated Nintendogs as a console seller. That's just my speculation, but I don't think many people were running to the store to buy a 3DS for Nintendogs. They may have been better off releasing a Nintendogs game later when the install base was already there, but what do I know? Pilot Wings Resort was an interesting one. I've always found this game very charming, partly due to the fact that Pilot Wings 64 was also a launch title for the N64 back in the day. Pilot Wings Resort is a very simple game, however I do think it holds value as a launch title. It did a really good job showing off the 3D effect, and is an all-around fun, relaxing game. However, once again I must point out that I don't think anyone in the world said to themselves, I need a 3DS right now after seeing a new Pilot Wings game. As for Nintendo's third and final launch title, we got Steel Diver. This is a very strange game in Nintendo's catalog. It doesn't have any of the Nintendo charm you would expect, and while it does serve as a good demo for some of the 3DS tech, such as gyro controls, that's really all you get. There's not a lot of content here. I also found one of the big flaws was that you spend a lot of time looking down at the touchscreen, meaning you aren't benefiting from the 3D effect. This isn't all too surprising since Steel Diver was actually once meant to be a DS game, but for a 3DS launch title to not take full advantage of the 3D, that feels kind of unacceptable to me. And I hate to keep repeating myself, but you're not drawing a lot of attention to your new system with a game like this. On top of the disappointing launch lineup, the price seemed to be causing some hesitation for people. $250 may not sound like a lot, but for the time, it kinda was. I mean, to put it in perspective for you, a Steam Deck only costs $350 today. So now think about the 3DS costing $250 13 years ago. Ultimately, this was the fatal flaw for most in-home 3D devices. The cost was just super high. Reggie made that one of his first talking points at E3 2010. The $250 price point didn't look bad compared to other 3D devices on the market, so maybe Nintendo was banking on that. But compared to other gaming products, this price was a tough pill to swallow for many. Combine the steep price with a bad launch lineup, and I really can't say I'm surprised that the 3DS got off to such a bad start. But I think there were other factors at play here too. For one, I think the primary concept of the console, the 3D effect, was difficult to sell without seeing it firsthand. Perhaps that's why Nintendo brought out 100 3DS consoles for the media to use for themselves at E3 2010. They knew it was a see it to believe it kind of console. Some of the more casual consumers that are so crucial for a system to succeed may have doubted that the glasses-free feature would actually work as advertised. I also remember some of the media talking about the 3D effect being bad for your eyes. I even recall my dad at one point saying he didn't want to buy it for me because he was worried about the 3D hurting my eyes. Of course, the handheld market itself was also shifting around this time, with smartphones becoming more and more prevalent. Over the first several months, the console was just not moving any units. In July 2011, Nintendo had reported that only 830,000 3DS consoles had been sold since it launched in March of that same year. Nintendo reportedly lost $485 million during this time. With the Wii on its last legs, things were not only looking bad for the 3DS, they were looking bad for Nintendo in general. I was only 10 years old at this time, so that was before I really paid attention to video game console sales and stuff like that, but even back then, I could tell something was wrong, because literally every single kid I knew had a Wii and or a DS, and yet I knew maybe 2 people with a 3DS. I think one of the largest reasons for the poor sales was that the game output was continuing to struggle. Nintendo had yet to release any major system sellers. The only high-profile first-party games they had released by July 2011 were Star Fox 64 3D and The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. Now don't get me wrong, those are fantastic games. They were already among the best games in Nintendo's catalog, and they transitioned flawlessly to the 3D handheld. Star Fox 64 3D was a perfect game for the 3D effect in my opinion, and having Ocarina of Time on a portable console was incredible. But once again, these games weren't really enough to start selling systems. If you already owned a 3DS, they were great to have. But if 2 ports of N64 games are your biggest games on the platform, you're gonna have a tough time getting people to shell out $250. But wait a minute, what happened to that unprecedented level of third-party support Nintendo had promised at E3 2010? Maybe those third parties were carrying some of the game output. Nah, that wasn't happening either. The abysmal launch made most of the third parties hit the brakes immediately. Sega delayed 2 of their 3DS games, Konami delayed their Metal Gear game, and Capcom straight up cancelled Mega Man Legends 3, which was going to be a 3DS exclusive. Many worried the 3DS may be dead in the water. Things were looking truly awful. It was going to take a miracle to fix this, but thankfully, Nintendo had one up their sleeves. This, my friends, is how to save a console. On July 28, 2013, Nintendo announced they would be slashing the price of the 3DS from $250 all the way down to $170. This was truly an unprecedented price cut. Not only did it drop the price by a whopping $80, they were doing it less than 6 months after the console had launched. Iwata himself acknowledged Nintendo had never done something like this before. A price cut may seem like a simple solution when a console is selling badly, but it's really not that easy. Video game consoles are typically always sold at a loss, meaning the console itself costs more to produce than the price they sell it for. Companies do this under the expectation that the person who buys the system will also buy tons of games, accessories, and subscriptions, which will more than make up for the money lost from the console sale. So with that in mind, we can assume the 3DS was already being sold at a loss at $250, and now it was being sold for only $170. That's pretty brutal from a business standpoint. However, Nintendo was willing to take that risk, as most companies are when their consoles are really struggling. But at the same time, a price drop like this so dramatic and so soon really risks alienating your fans who bought it for full price. Considering those who bought the console early are probably your biggest die-hard fans, those are not the kinds of people you want to be angering. However, Nintendo did have a nice plan in place for them with the Nintendo 3DS Ambassador program. This was Nintendo's way of apologizing to those who bought a console with no new games for $80 more than they had to. And jokes aside, this was genuinely one of the best early adopter perks I've ever seen from any console. 3DS ambassadors would receive 20 free virtual console games. The first 10 were NES games, and these weren't all too special. It was the typical NES games that they would release on every single console, like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. What made this program truly great was the other 10 games available, because Nintendo would also be giving 10 free Game Boy Advance games. And some of these GBA games were truly incredible to see offered, including a lot of games that we had never seen released as virtual console games before, such as The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap, Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones, and Metroid Fusion. These 10 GBA games were far from filler games. They were some of the best games available for that system. I remember my best friend growing up had gotten his 3DS before the price drop, but I didn't. So he had all these GBA games and I was so damn jealous. I can remember having conversations with him where I said, surely I'll be able to buy those games someday. And he would just tell me it was never gonna happen. And he was right, because those 10 GBA games were never released for public purchase. So to this day, the only way to officially play GBA games on your 3DS was if you bought it before the price drop. This initiative was already great due to the sheer amount of games and quality of games you were getting for free. But when you combine that with the fact that it made you part of a very selective group of people who were able to download and play games that no one else could, that made it truly fantastic. Okay, so step 1 was complete. Nintendo had made it right with their diehard fans who bought the console early, but now they still needed to convince new players to buy the 3DS. And as it turned out, the solution was pretty simple: release good games. Unless you were a huge fan of Pokemon Rumble Blast, game output continued to be very slow and lackluster for the next several months after the price drop. But all of that was finally going to change in the holiday season of 2011 with 2 giant releases. On November 13, 2011, Super Mario 3D Land was released in North America to rave reviews. The game was a monumental moment for the franchise, as it was the first time an original 3D Mario game was being released on a handheld. Not only was 3D Land a fantastic Mario game in general, it also masterfully used the 3D effect as more than just a gimmick. It actually intertwined with the gameplay. I think 3D Land really helped demonstrate what the 3D effect was truly capable of. In many ways, it helped to justify the existence of the 3DS. Super Mario 3D Land is one of my favorite 3DS games. I was obsessed with it as a kid. It was one of those games that I would go back to constantly. I probably fully 100% completed this game like 5 different times. Whenever I was bored of the games I owned or had a long car ride ahead of me, I would pop 3D Land in and play it all over again. It's one of my favorite childhood games ever, and it holds such a special place in my heart. There weren't many 3DS games that I spent more hours playing than 3D Land, but Mario Kart 7 was one of them. And believe it or not, Mario Kart 7 released less than a month after 3D Land on December 4th, 2011 in North America. I don't know if we'll ever see something like this from Nintendo again. We got a brand new 3D Mario and a brand new Mario Kart within 1 month of each other. It was incredible. And just like that, in the span of a few weeks, Nintendo had made up for an entire year of slow releases. Combine the release of 2 generation-defining games with a console that had just received an $80 price drop, and suddenly everyone wanted a 3DS. After the price drop and the 2 Mario games hitting the market, everything really started rolling for the 3DS starting in the holiday of 2011 and going into 2012. 2012 was a huge year for the 3DS, with some major releases including Resident Evil Revelations, Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater 3D, Kid Icarus Uprising, Kingdom Hearts 3D, New Super Mario Bros. 2, and the worst game ever made, Paper Mario Sticker Star. The momentum from the end of 2011 combined with a steady flow of new releases led the 3DS to a huge year, selling 13.5 million consoles in 2012 alone. To put that in perspective for you, the 3DS only sold 3.6 million consoles in 2011. 2013 was an even better year for the console, with some of the biggest games the platform would ever see being released. In 2013, we got a new Luigi's Mansion game, a new Pokemon game, a new Animal Crossing game, and a new Zelda game. The 3DS was continuing to sell like crazy, with nearly 14 million consoles sold in 2013, and another 12 million consoles being sold in 2014. Looking back, it's truly incredible how many games Nintendo was able to get out in such a short amount of time, especially since they were also trying to support their home console, the Wii U, at the same time. The 3DS continued to be a major success story for Nintendo throughout its entire life cycle, and the 3DS lasted a very long time, with new first-party games still being released even a few years into the Switch's life. Production of 3DS hardware lasted all the way until 2020, before finally being discontinued. The final hardware sales for the 3DS line of consoles sits at 76 million, a massive success for a console that once looked dead in the water. I've seen some online debate whether the 3DS should be considered a disappointment, mainly because even though 76 million is great, it was only half as many consoles as its predecessor sold. And despite the 3DS success, Nintendo, and actually no other console manufacturer for that matter, has made a traditional handheld console since. But if you're going to call the 3DS a disappointment, I personally couldn't disagree more. 76 million units sold may have been half as many as the DS, but it's still an extremely high number. There are countless consoles throughout history that would have loved to say they sold 76 million units. On top of that, I think the library of 3DS games rivals any other console out there in terms of quality of games and also just the sheer amount of games released. However, I do wonder if Nintendo might see the 3DS as a disappointment, primarily from a multimedia device perspective. Remember, Nintendo promoted the fact that it could display 3D movies before they had even shown a game. Clearly, they hoped it could become a device similar to the PS2. For those unaware, part of the reason the PS2 sold so well was because it was the cheapest way to get a DVD player at the time. I think Nintendo thought the 3DS could have a similar trajectory, being the cheapest 3D device on the market, but that just never really came together. The 3D feature in general became more and more diluted with every year the console existed. Games didn't always use the 3D in engaging ways, and by the end of the console's life cycle, many games were not even including 3D at all. Now, if third parties were choosing not to use the 3D, that would be one thing, but even Nintendo themselves started moving away from it. Nintendo released 3DS variants called 2DS that had no 3D display, and Nintendo even released multiple high-profile first-party games with no 3D compatibility, such as Super Mario Maker for 3DS and Hey Pikmin. By the end of the 3DS lifecycle, no one really used it as a 3D device. It was just Nintendo's current handheld. So in that sense, one could definitely argue the whole 3D situation was a definite disappointment. But as a general product, I just can't see how anyone could view it as a disappointment. I grew up with the 3DS, so there is certainly some bias, but what's not biased is to consider the failure of the Wii U at the same time. I don't think it can be ignored how important the 3DS was for Nintendo during this era. The Wii U had flopped, and unlike the 3DS, Nintendo was never able to save it, no matter what they tried. The failure of the Wii U was catastrophic. But as a Nintendo fan at the time, it didn't always feel that way thanks to how many incredible games we were getting on the 3DS. The 3DS support was able to keep fans fairly happy even in the darkest days of the Wii U era, and the financial success of the 3DS was no doubt helping Nintendo stay afloat too. Could you imagine what Nintendo's financials would have looked like during this time if the Wii U and 3DS had both ended up as failures? I imagine they would have been fine because they're Nintendo and they have like unlimited money, but I can assure you some very uncomfortable conversations about their future would have been had if both these consoles had failed. Nintendo's home console market was in such a bad place. So while the 3DS didn't sell as well as the DS, it still carried Nintendo during this era, and that has to be respected. Looking back, the way Nintendo saved the 3DS was actually really simple. They dropped the price and put out great games, and they were able to turn it around completely. But I must admit, there was a lot of luck involved here as well. There have been plenty of consoles to drop their price and release great games that were never able to find success. But the 3DS was able to do enough to draw consumers in, and I think its success was an incredible feat where truly everything came together perfectly. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by giving it a like and subscribing. I find the history of consoles extremely interesting, so I think How to Save a Console will become a recurring series on this channel. I may even make variations called How Not to Save a Console for the systems that were not able to turn it around. Let me know what other consoles you would like to see me talk about next in the comments below.